Welcome to the FRCL Weekly Call. We're a group of distribution leads who get together regularly to discuss works in progress, share ideas, and create opportunities for cross-distro collaboration.
All right, here we are. It's January 21st. We are Fedora RHEL and CentOS leads, and we are here to exchange information for our communities. So the topic for today that was suggested by Michel was how to handle security embargoes in a community context. So I don't actually see Michel on, but I know that other folks also had a concern about this or questions about this, problems that they experience, and I know some of it has to do with who to get in touch with. So Davide, do you want to talk to it?
I have a sidebar with Michel. He should be joining soon.
Okay, great. Well, while we're waiting, I would like to introduce a Red Hatter. Jeremy West has joined us today. Jeremy, do you want to introduce yourself?
Sure. So, long-time Fedora user, long-time Red Hat user. I've been at Red Hat for not quite as long as Brendan, 20 years. Did frontline support for many, many years. I now manage our product security incident response team. So this is a cool topic for me to kind of weigh in on, but happy to be a part of the group.
Okay, well, while we're waiting for Michel, I'll just talk to a couple of the things that came up in the FRCL chat as like enumeration of issues. So when we talked last week, I said, hey, if you want to know who to get in touch with, you can, like, the right way to get in touch with somebody is to actually file an issue in the RHEL Jira project, and then it will be auto-assigned to the maintainer. And here was 100% of my thought process. That it was the thing that has always been true in Bugzilla. And since Bugzilla seems to be what is considered perfection and state of the art, it should clearly be good enough, right? And like, oh, that's fallacious reasoning. It is the case that is what happened before. And so that's like we didn't regress, but it is also the case that that's not exactly a great experience. So Davide, do you want to take it from here?
Actually, it's not true that this was the case with Bugzilla, because I had plenty of cases with Bugzilla where you file a ticket and it gets assigned to either a dummy user or it gets assigned to null, which was my favorite example, which happened when the team that was supposed to own a thing at Red Hat got disbanded or something, and they forgot to reassign the ownership.
Yeah, exactly.
So
the exact
stuff
same
like
way.
that's not ideal. But like outside of that, I think the problem with the filing a ticket approach is that it works when you're asking for something specific, but there's times where you want to contact somebody to either have like a high-level conversation or to discuss things like an embargo, for example, that require some amount of finesse. So it would be useful to just know who the person is so you can reach out on the appropriate back channel. So I don't have to bug people, because what I end up doing now is effectively message someone I know and like, hey, can you please look internally who the person is for this so I can ask them and give me an email. And like, I can do that because I know people, but like, that is not an option for most prospective contributors.
Yeah, and that's the kind of thing that we definitely do want to make it very easy to report. Neal, go ahead.
Yeah, so I was going to say, like, part of the other problem is that, like, so Davide mentioned that it also kind of there's a lot of cases where we wind up seeing where it goes to like some kind of group or the famous empty null thing. But also there are cases where it gets assigned to a group user and we know what the group email address is, but the group email address is actually not accessible. And emails from Bugzilla or Jira will bounce as well because they're actually just internal Google groups and they're not actually set up to take mail. And so like even in the case where we know that there's a group or a team address to reach out to, they basically fail. And the most recent case of this happening was the reason why FESCO ultimately said, you can't make fake group users anymore. because we had a couple of bugs where we couldn't reach out, we couldn't find anyone, we couldn't get in touch with anyone because the email addresses all bounced, and it's just it isn't a workable situation when you have stuff like that happening. And yeah, so it's just, you know, it is slightly more complicated than just, hey, this is a team address, because team addresses in themselves aren't necessarily bad. The problem is that those team addresses don't work, and we don't know who's actually responsible in the end when we're trying to figure out what we need to do. And it's particularly bad when we're down to the last mile, and it's like, we have like 1 week to save the world kind of situation. Those are really not fun places to be.
Okay, now it's fine. The other thing I would say is, I think this would not be quite as much of a problem if we had a channel, like a public channel that we could just use to ask for stuff. Like, I think in the case of Fedora, if there are doubts about things like these, I can go on Fedora Devel or Matrix and ask, and I can have a reasonable assumption that people will be around, and like within like an hour or two, somebody will reply and help. We don't have these effectively for CentOS and for RHEL. Like, we have the CentOS Devel room, but there's only a few people in there. There's definitely not an expectation that maintainers of packages in RHEL hang out there, at least for now. So we don't quite have enough of the critical mass to allow somebody that is not already connected to ask in a public channel and realistically get a reasonable response back.
I was going to also add, you know, this is specific to embargoes, but you never know how many people are subscribed to a mailing list. And then in the world of security, you want to keep principles of least privilege at play, right? So, yeah, the opposite end of the extreme. You never know if you're going to have somebody respond, or you never know if you're going to have 50 people looking at it.
I'm going to take my hand down. Go ahead, Michel.
Sorry, muted. Yeah, speaking of the embargo, the one thing that's a problem is sometimes that, you know, like the suggestion at the previous meeting was like, oh, if you want to know who the Red Hat maintainer is, just follow Jira, and then it will surface who's assigned to its maintainer. But we can't, I guess we can follow private Jira and like, you know, like mark it as security, and then like see who gets assigned. But then like we also don't have, Red Hat maintainers might not be on like the Fedora matrix. We've had at least one person basically say like, oh, matrix is very spammy for them, and they're like, can we use Slack? And I was like, we are not Red Hat employees, we cannot use Slack. And can we use Signal? So it ended up being Signal. But like, there is no consistent way, right? Like, and we basically spend at least some time negotiating how to actually set up a private secure channel.
So I want to throw something out there, is like, and don't read too far into this yet, because it's not like these are like eggs that we're putting in the basket, but I'm not sure if they'll stay in the basket, right? Like, to borrow a stupid phrase. But the CRA, the Cyber Resiliency Act, is pushing Red Hat and many other companies to make a lot of changes and to improve kind of how we do some things. One of those being the idea of having stewardship, having large companies like Red Hat be a steward for smaller projects, upstream projects. This is primarily because the requirements, the CRA requirements, are very hard for a lot of smaller projects to be able to stay on top of and manage. So, you know, you should have somebody that has the resourcing to be able to help. So as part of this, the CRA initiatives happening in Red Hat, my team is being funded for with a couple of positions to help with our community projects. One of those, of course, being Fedora. So one of the changes that I would expect to see is when it comes to incident response, incident management, and this does not mean every CVE, but for the known exploits, the embargoes, things where we want a higher degree of coordination, those people that are going to be joining my team will be proactive in reaching out to key contacts within CentOS or the Fedora community to help coordinate those. It's not just going to be a dump and run scenario where, you know, a tracker gets created, an issue gets created, and it's assigned to some random, you know, Google group or whatever else. So like there is an intent there going forward later this summer to improve on that incident handling.
Well, for anybody new here, if your hand is the green hand, just go ahead and start talking. You don't need to be called on.
So I think my hand is the green hand. This ties nicely into the topic of the quality of bug reports that was raised, discussed in FESCO, and there was some public discussion about this. And I think that the resolution was that we, from our side, Kevin Fenzi would reach out to somebody within Red Hat and discuss the issue. But I think since we are kind of touching on the topic, we can also touch this. So the maintainers in Fedora are unhappy that the average quality of bugs reported from Red Hat security is low, that there is a deluge of low priority bugs that nobody has time or even doesn't make sense to react to them. And well, there's a lot of repetition and so on and so on. So I don't know, like if we want people to be more responsive to bugs, then we should probably try to at least do some easy changes like cutting off all bug reports that are below, I don't know, moderate or even below critical.
As a data point, I personally find I maintain a lot of packages in Fedora, and I have access on way too many packages. I find the value of the automated CVE bugs that we get from Red Hat Security to be mostly negative, in that in the vast majority of cases, these are noise, and very rarely they're an actual thing. But the problem is so many of those are noise that they end up, effectively, I rarely looked at these unless somebody points out to me, hey, this is an actual bug. Like just today, I got 5 tickets for Asai installer, which is a Python thing that like is only in Fedora because we need it for firmware updates on Apple Silicon, and somehow the bug is about issues with the Python library that sends email via IMAP and POP3, which I am pretty sure this thing has nothing to do with and probably only pulls in via some recursive import or whatever. Like stuff like that is just not useful. And even worse, I maintain a couple of things that are in JavaScript, and like the amount of bugs those get because of the node ecosystem is insane. And I get why that happens, but it's just not useful. So I don't know what the right solution is here. But at least in the Fedora context, I fully agree with Vishek. I don't think the current system is working.
Yeah, I'll add to that. And I'm actually meeting with Kevin later this week, I think, to talk through some of these challenges. And one of the goals that I have in those conversations is to look at some of the patterns and underlying reasons why why we're seeing some of those bad false findings, and find ways of improving that. So we're going to be working on that a little bit. The other thing I kind of wanted to point out, my brain just shut down. Somebody else go, and then maybe my brain will work again. Michelle?
Yes. Sorry, let me. Oh, I'm not muted. Good. Yeah, like with speaking of the JavaScript security bugs in particular, the one thing that's even worse than that is if you have a source tarball from a project that basically bundle like website documentation files, your project might not even be using the JavaScript artifact at all, and it will be like it will get JavaScript bugs filed against it. So if you can even filter like, oh hey, this code is these things are in the source archive, but it's not shipped in the binary artifacts. Maybe like don't file JavaScript bugs.
Yeah, I mean, this is a perfect example of where we need to make some improvements on how we do that determination. But thanks, Michelle. You spawned the thought in my head. This comes back to a life cycle thing, something Joanna was saying. Like in the RHEL side, we made a change in March of this year to only prioritize CVEs that have a CVSS base score greater than 7.0. Things below that just aren't priorities. Like if they end up incidentally getting fixed, great, right? But we could do something. I mean, this is something obviously for the Fedora team to kind of consider, but making some sort of a policy change, right? And all my team needs to know is what that policy is, and we'll try to adhere to that policy.
Yeah, so one of the questions on my mind is, how much of a burden is it if a maintainer gets a CVE report where their package is not affected? Because I think there is value in a paper trail that says, hey, we know that the CVE exists and don't worry about it. This Fedora package does not suffer from that problem because maybe the code isn't there or it's not activated in the config or something like whatever the reason. Like actually having a maintainer stake a fact out is, I think, valuable. The value isn't simply in if there's an actual bug it gets fixed. The value is in if you are a user of the software, you want to know, am I vulnerable to this thing? And should I care about this thing?
So I can kind of respond to this because this actually happens disproportionately to me as a matter of course, because I'm the maintainer of a lot of multimedia software, including the FFmpeg library, where I get a lot of CVE reports for things we do not actually have shipped and enabled. The on the face of it, I think your idea is somewhat correct. I think there is some value in saying hey, we have verified that this is not affecting our package, and so that's fine. But the problem is when you get a deluge of it, and and it changes the signal to noise ratio, because it is actually a fair bit of work to go look at a CV, understand the properties of it, then look at the source code, check the build data to see whether it's directly or worse, indirectly affected in some way, because that's where the complexity comes in. You can say, oh, foo.c has this thing. Well, now I got to figure out whether foo.c is actually pulled in and actually part of the package. It is valuable in some way, but it's also it's a question of if the signal to noise ratio was a little bit on the higher side of signal, then yes, it is actually it's fine, because then we can go and say, okay, we know this for certain. The amount of time it actually takes to verify that this is in fact not applicable the juice becomes worth the squeeze, right? But if you have a high volume of CV reports that don't apply, then it masks the volume of ones that do, and it becomes a lot harder for someone to go in and say, okay, I can have some confidence in solve these. What I wind up doing personally, if the CV bug report doesn't get aged out by the time that the next point release gets shipped and updated, I just attach all the CVEs and then just kind of hold my nose and hope everything is fine, because quite likely they are all fixed with another release of the software. But it's also just so much time and effort to go individually verify each one of them. I only got so many hours in the day, and I have lots of other things to do. And for the most part, we as Fedora contributors are not paid to do that stuff. It's a little bit of a different calculation when you're looking at it from Red Hat Enterprise Linux, where most of the folks, or all the folks, hopefully, are actually paid to work on this. And there is a general expectation that from the agreements that you have with your customers, clients, partners, whatever terminology you want to use here, that you have coherent, consistent, and comprehensive information about the state of the security of Red Hat Enterprise Linux. For Fedora, nobody is making those guarantees. Nobody's making those claims. And unless we had something like what OpenSUSE does, where they have the SUSE security team who has actually a dedicated sub team that all they do is work on OpenSUSE stuff. If we had an equivalent with Red Hat Product Security for Fedora, I don't think there is a reasonable way for us to get to that kind of assurance, because it's just so much work for someone who's already got to do with a lot of other things, who are probably only doing this for maybe 1 to 3 hours a week, and that's being generous in a lot of cases. So
yeah, I want to second pretty much everything that Neal said here. Like, I think the fundamental problem is that this ends up assigning work to volunteers, and it assigns a sometimes disproportionate amount of work. And I think this isn't just a problem for people like Neal and myself and Michel that have a lot of packages, but it's also a problem for like the packager that only has a handful of things and wakes up one morning and finds 35 bugs that they're probably not qualified to triage. For what it's worth, we had the exact same problem at work, where at one point, like with my person that owns the OS at work had, I was getting hundreds of reports per day for like random security issues in like X11 or whatever. And the way we fixed it at work was that the security folks got a bunch of TPMs that do triage of the issues before they actually file them. So even if they don't have domain expertise on the package, they can at least do some amount of cursory evaluation on this is something that actually matters versus no, this is complete bullshit. There's no point in filing it. And yeah, this is hard. But I think shifting the burden a bit where the people filing the tickets do some amount of triage would help a lot mitigate things. And also I think would make things better. Because as a packager, if I know at least somebody puts some modicum of care in filing this, I'm more likely to look at it. Right now, frankly, these look like automated things. So I'm pretty unlikely to care unless somebody points out ahead of time that this is actually important.
Going to what Brandon asked directly, like about whether there is value in that just for like record keeping. I agree there is value, but the cost-benefit analysis basically is like if the, as people pointed out, like this is like it might swamp actual bugs that you have to respond to, especially if you're busy and and you're a volunteer with a few little spare time. If you can make it so that you can say, hey, my package is definitely never going to be affected by this class of bug, never file this again, then yes, there is value. But if not, at some point it's like the boy who cried wolf, and like maintainers will just stop engaging with security bugs, which is really not what we want. Unfortunately, I don't know how to do that with Bugzilla. So, like maybe we
it's
can
not really an issue tracker
abuse
thing.
a feature flag. We can do a feature flag, right? We can say, hey, like this is security flag, I don't know, like not affected by like a JavaScript. You said it once and like some script, like put that package on a do not touch list. I don't know, there are ways to get around it if you really want to do it.
Yeah, you're up.
I'm to a point on the inclusion of various binary blobs. I thought that the purpose of compiling Fedora with frame pointers with all of the debugging enabled was specifically to allow for this kind of introspection. And so I do kind of wonder if perhaps the security analysis things should be taking greater advantage of debug info D before filing bugs against binary files, as it feels like it should be, if not trivially determinable, at least not annoyingly determinative, to look at a binary object and say, yes, it has this C file inside of it calling this function.
So I just want to confirm that this really affects everybody. It's not only about maintainers with a lot of packages. Like I personally do not maintain much now, but previously I did. And even when I was paid package maintainer, the time still has to be spent. Somebody still has to go through those issues, and I was maintaining of JavaScript libraries, so I can feel you guys. I know how it is with the ecosystem, and I know how it is when you get CVEs opened which are not really relevant to your code base or to the package that you are shipping, but to whatever documentation, whatever part of the thing that you got in your chip. And that said, I'm not really sure there is a value in it if the flood is as it is. Like, if we don't get more quality in what's being reported, and context as was said, like, is this really in the binary? Was this really shipped somewhere, or is it just a documentation or test suite or something similar? I think unless that is somehow incorporated, the value is it's too expensive to spend that many cycles of maintainers on finding out that they are not affected by dozens of bugs.
I have a similar comment, but I guess more generic. I think this is a rather common pattern for Fedora and Red Hat collaboration, which happens when we try to bring some of the enterprise-related requirements or approaches to the Fedora distribution for good reasons, but we sometimes just like try to copy the approach from enterprise development to the community distribution and hope that it will just work the same way. But then, like, the scale consideration comes in, the expectations comes in, the volunteer nature of the work comes in, and so on. And all of these, like, oh, you cannot apply actual enterprise security policies to the community-driven distribution. And it doesn't make necessarily the community distribution bad. It just, like, we need to understand what it is a different style of a distribution, and it just cannot fulfill all the requirements automatically, all the requirements of like strictly compliant, super important downstream distribution. That's why we have downstream distribution. So I think this is what we should keep in mind, and it comes to infrastructure topics as well as like CVE topics, for example. So yeah, there is a strict compliance requirements when you do supply chain for the downstream very heavy distribution, but like we physically cannot do that in the community distribution because we will never have enough money and we will never have enough resources to introduce these rules at such scale. So we need to downgrade our expectations a lot when we move from enterprise compliance topics to the which parts of this can actually make sense in the community distribution topics. And like having much heavier filters on like automated CVE bug reporting would be a very reasonable approach. Like make it so that we only see the most critical issues first, and then consider whether we can scale up above that ever, and how much resources it will have. So that's my comment on this side.
I'm sorry, I was muted. A lot of good ideas being presented here. I did want to make it clear, like my team, I suspect, is the culprit for a lot of the bug reports that get filed. Probably not all of the bug reports that get filed, but it is very automated. There isn't a whole lot of analysis. We have the same challenge that the rest of you have, right? I have 12 people, like I was saying in chat, for the entire Red Hat portfolio, not just RHEL. There's, with the volume of CVEs these days, we've reached a scale issue. It's like, how do you do proper analysis on every single CVE coming in for every product, right? So if there are tips, and I welcome all the great ideas being tossed around right here, but like if there are scripts that we can incorporate into more scripted approaches that will allow us to scale better, I'm all for it.
So on that note, what can we do to help automate the process for the community maintainers?
It seems like we've got. Oh, sorry, David, keep going.
Yeah, I mean, it just seemed to me like that's it's a constant fate. If if we're passing them over the fence, then there should be the same kind of opportunity to reject using some sort of a standard functionality. Neal pointed out FFmpeg and the fact that there are things that we don't ship. Should be easy enough to just reject all the bugs that are related to things that we don't ship.
Okay, so my guess is that we probably don't want to jump into a solution here and now, but we should have some follow-ups. So for me, I'm hearing kind of two major threads here. The first is sometimes I need to talk to a responsible party at Red Hat about a security vulnerability, and I don't want to talk to anybody but the right person. So that's like one half of it. And the other half is sometimes I get deluged with a bazillion CVEs, and it sucks because I'm volunteering my time here, and most of these are nonsense. Like, I think one of those are valid, and each one of those deserves some coverage. So is there a third one, or is that roughly a good breakdown of the thread?
I think the other one would be, what is the generic expectation from the Fedora distribution? With like what is the policy we actually want to apply? It's one thing is like how do we apply it, but the other would be how do we define what we want to achieve?
Right. So I think it'd be fair to say in 2025, the number of CVEs that showed up per day markedly increased. And part of that was because we got new authorities. Part of that was because there's just more people looking. I don't think that number is going to go down. So having good policy makes a lot of sense. And it sounds like Jeremy would be happy to collaborate with affected communities on what a good policy is. Like we have one for RHEL. Is there a specific follow-up that we should have with FESCO? Is this FESCO domain even? Like, where could that conversation take place?
I don't know if there is a space to do that. So in the olden times, I would say like there's the Fedora security team. But the Fedora security team has been defunct and broken for like 10 years. So we don't actually have a place to have this discussion in a way where we have people who have understanding and a coherent view of how things work within Fedora, because there isn't anybody really running the security wheels in Fedora. Like, just offhand, I think the last security related change that came in from Red Hat was in Fedora 32, which was a full 6 years ago. So I don't really know if we have an avenue for that right now. And so like the best but probably poor substitute is FESCO, but I would personally say we are probably not equipped to figure this out. Like the ideal scenario is that there would be somebody in Red Hat product security as an additional person, as in not taking up the load of the existing 12 people, an additional person who essentially starts full-time just doing Fedora stuff, getting the house in order, figuring out the things, and being the point of contact to figure out, get feedback, help build those things, and essentially restart the Fedora security team with a blend of community and Red Hat participants. But again, that's just off the top of my head what I'm thinking of. I'm not even sure if it's feasible or even possible, but that's the way I think would probably set us up for success.
At the risk of derailing the conversation, I would mention, I think there are two sides of this. Where is the place and who does the work? So I think whenever we say there is no dedicated place for some engineering topic, then that place is FESCO, which means FESCO environment, like meetings, tickets, discussion areas, are the place where the rest of the community can also participate and join, and this can be worked together, unless FESCO points to a specific place where this can be handed over. So, but in this conversation, FESCO works as a facilitator of a discussion and like decision making and hints to what might be lead us to some decisions and so on. But it doesn't, like, FESCO is not an answer to who does this work, actually. Someone still needs to come to FESCO, start this discussion, make sure that it doesn't like died out and so on. So, and that person can be anyone. And of course, it would be nice if it would be Red Hatter specifically sponsored to do this work, because yeah, it doesn't look like a easy volunteer-driven job.
Okay, so just want to mention for the folks that are having the parallel conversation in the chat, like bring it in with your voice if you can, because that's going to be more useful.
Yeah, so just to bring out what I said there, I manage the sysadmins for Fedora as well as CentOS, and I am trying to build up some of what was brought up here, as in kind of picking up the slack from, not having a security team as part of all this. But I can't do it. I don't believe I can do it to the same level as what is hoped for. We have a focus on keeping things running and keeping things secure, trying to bucket that beyond into, response time on packages and development and stuff. I don't think the guy that I have that is interested in this would be able to do that on his own. Nor do I think, repurposing all of my folks or some subset of my folks away from CentOS or Fedora to this specifically would gain what we want either. So I do fully agree that is what we need, or what we should aspire to, I guess is what I should say. I just personally don't know how we get there with the resources that we have, but I want to get there. That is what I want to see too.
Jeremy, unmute.
You unmute.
I did it again. I agree with everything Steve said. A couple of things. I am meeting with Steve and Kevin later, and we're going to talk through this a little bit. I want to identify, I think this is going to be an iterative approach that we have to take. Right? We're not going to solve all of the bug reporting issues in one fell swoop, but I want to determine where the most pressing problems are at and start going after some of those problems. I think bringing those 2 CRA resources online for my team is going to help with the incident coordination bits. And I think in meeting with Steve and Kevin, we can talk about some of the false positives, bug filing, and try to tackle the low-hanging fruit. To answer some of the questions here on chat from the automated standpoint, it is very automated. And it is almost entirely based off of manifest SBOM data. And if that data is bad, we get a lot of bad findings, right? So if that could be an area where we take a look initially, right, is how do we improve some of that data so that maybe it's a bit more granular, maybe what we have is out of date, I'm not sure, right? But if we can improve that, then we can improve some of that automation. So that's where we're going to dig in. But I do have somebody on my team who's my workflow lead. I'd like to get them plugged in, whether it's FESCO as the forum or something else. But I would expect them to take the lead from my standpoint on my team and making improvements to how we file those bugs.
I wanted to go back to what Steve said and slightly contradict with this, because I feel like we really need to not just try to catch up with every single security compliance requirement which world develops in the last 10 years, but also be able to push back on some of them. And I think that's also important part for Fedora project and for Fedora team is to identify the ways when we say, you know what, no, this requirement is just too much for a community-driven distribution. If you really need this, don't come to us, come to the vendor, which really has the capacity and commitments and resources and whatever, and pay that vendor. And we need to learn how to set that, because if we're just like aspire to address everyone's concerns about supply chain security, and every government in the world has recently created their own compliance document, how to address it and so on, like we will not win that race if we will just like run in all these directions at the same time. We need to set up the smaller goals and say, this is what we will do, and we will do it well. We cannot do all the rest of it and just like find proper vendor to do that for you and pay them. And this is if you really require that level. That would be an important part of this conversation. Yeah.
On the automation front, I think the problem isn't necessarily the SBOM data itself, but it's that the CVE feeds are complete garbage these days. And like, at least from, I routinely hear complaints from people in the security space on my side on how a lot of the stuff that comes on the CVE feeds is bad. So it requires significant human curation to turn that. And there's actually quite a few companies that like, their business is giving you a nicely curated CVE feed that combines a bunch of stuff and is less garbage than what you would get from like the Mitra or whatever the standard one is. So that's one thing. But also, I think a lot of the, and to the point that David was making earlier, we could probably look at what tools we could give packagers to better assess whether vulnerabilities are relevant for them and what they could do. And I don't know what that would look like, but that's an avenue that could be interesting to explore. On the staffing point, I don't think we will solve this by saying, well, instead of every packager having to triage security issues, let's have one human in the security team triage them. That will just burn the human out. What I think you could look at is what would it take to staff a small team that isn't necessarily responsible for triaging everything, but that can put guidelines in place for what it makes sense to steer the automation towards, and that can be like kind of an escalation point for, if I as a packager get a thing and I don't know what it is, I can go to these folks and tell them, hey, I'm not quite sure what's going on here. Or if I get a report that's complete bullshit, I can surface it in like, hey, this is noise. What can we do to improve the automation so I don't get this again? That I think could be valuable work, but I don't think you solve that by like getting one person on it. I think this is you staff a 2-3 people team, potentially either be it paid or volunteers, doesn't matter. And then over the course of a year, people figure it out, which is, what Neal was saying, like getting the house in order and bringing back the Fedora security team. And I absolutely agree with Aleksandra. I think one of the jobs here would be to also figure out what is actually in scope and what isn't, and what makes sense and what doesn't. Because obviously Fedora isn't going to have the same like guarantee. I don't think Fedora should even probably have SLAs or SLOs around this stuff, because we can't realistically meet it because it's all volunteers. But we can do expectation settings. We can say, hey, we tried to be responsive to CVEs. And if something is really, really bad and we get to the embargo channels, we will try to not fuck it up too badly. But also understand that if you rely on this for like, I don't know, a medical device or something, maybe you should not run Fedora on that. You should run something else.
So yeah, I agree with Aleksandra. I agree with Jeremy. I agree with Davide. I agree with Neal. I'm not exactly sure what we're disagreeing about. So I just wanted to bring that up. I feel like we're kind of just talking a little bit more about the implementations and details more so than the need to have some sort of way to contact people for security that something could possibly happen there with. So I just wanted to bring that up. Go ahead, Brendan.
Yeah, so since we are closing in on the end of our time, I think we should take a few minutes to talk about next steps, because if we don't have next steps from this conversation, then why do we bother having it? All right, so I've got at least 3 things in mind. I want to run those 3 by you and see if there's anything extra that makes sense to commit to right now. So one of those is that, and I'm going to shift us back to the beginning. One of those is that it seems like people in the community do not know necessarily how to get in touch with Red Hat about embargoed issues. And it feels, or embargoed security issues, or what should be an embargoed security issue. We all discover things periodically, and we want to know who to talk to, and we want to not accidentally talk to the wrong person. So I think one very positive outcome from this conversation could be that in the Fedora documentation and in the CentOS documentation, there's a page that says how to do this thing. And it might be the case that we don't have a good answer right now, but that we should probably be able to get to a good answer pretty quickly. So when we started this conversation, it's like, well, I don't know who the maintainer for this package is, so I don't know who to contact. Like, what if you knew who to contact, but they were on vacation or on leave or something? Like, it would still be a problem, right? So specific to security vulnerabilities, there needs to be a way to get in touch with somebody like Jeremy or a proxy or something like that for input where you know it's going to be continuously covered. Jeremy, is there a thing like that right now that we can just write down and have people use, or is that something that we would need to work on?
I mean, we have SecAlert at redhat.com, which feeds directly to my team and is manned 24/7. If you're looking for coordination for information on something, that would be the primary method.
Okay. Shall go ahead and then I'll get to part 2 and 3.
Can we send GPG encrypted emails to SecAlert? Because the problem is we cannot send plain text email, right?
No, you can send plain text. You can also send GPG encrypted.
Yeah, so the concern here specifically is for those of us that are on the secret list, there's like an assumption that if we're doing responsible disclosure, we're supposed to keep these things need to know. So it's tricky to email a list, and we can certainly email a list and say, hey, there may be a thing coming for X, and we establish secure communications, but it's not ideal. Like we can't use a mailing list as a channel for like disclosing a thing that's potentially vulnerable. Because also I know that some of you are also on the list, but some of you are not. So
No. This is not a mailing list, a traditional mailing list. This goes directly to, in the past it went directly to ServiceNow. Now it goes to JSM, Jira Service Manager. Only my team can view that. Nobody else. There are no archives. There's nothing that anybody else can view. This is what we use for coordinated vulnerability disclosure with all of our partners like Intel and AMD and others as well. I don't know if that helps your question.
If you don't have this documented already on like a public thing, you probably should.
It's documented.
And if you do, then yeah, we just never, like, this is the first I hear of these. So this is great that this exists, and I had no idea this existed. So we would try this the next time.
For what it's worth, I only vaguely knew that something like this existed, but I couldn't find the reference of it. So a link, and maybe we should put it somewhere prominent, would be a good idea as a starting point.
Right. So we will have a follow-up task of getting this information out there, and I'm going to ask CentOS leads, Fedora leads, please take the information that comes out, like the link that comes out, and put it in the correct place. So if I could actually get a volunteer for each of those, I would really appreciate it. Like somebody from the Fedora side, somebody from the CentOS side. If you're in both and you want to do both, that would be awesome.
I can talk to my folks to update documentation wherever that might be. I have the sysadmins for both.
The source of ultimate power, Steve. Okay.
Yep.
The first one. All right. The second one is, it sounds like there is a need, at least on the Fedora side, for a decision on at what level a CVE should be filed by Red Hat, because it might be going to a community member and it might be overly burdensome. So this is independent of how do we refine these CVEs. It is exclusive to whether it gets automatically filed or not. It sounds like that should be a FESCO discussion, for the lack of a better place. Aleksandra, what do you think?
I just wanted to mention that usually this is not a one-time decision. This is a ongoing process which needs to be iterated upon. So, like, we can draft an initial, FESCO can draft an initial vision of what is constitutes for security vulnerability, but we should include the expectation that it's going to be in discussion. Process to adjust that should be included in the vision.
Okay, so can we say that somebody in FESCO is going to bring this up inside FESCO in the next, say, 4 or 5 weeks, and maybe they can invite Jeremy into a conversation there. Like, what does a good follow-up look like for this? Jeremy's willing. He's got the thumb up.
If not me, somebody from my team.
Yeah.
Bishik said in the chat that he'd be willing to volunteer.
All right. Then we'll create a follow-up for that one and get it going. It has come to my attention that we are at the top of the hour. Part 3 was about refinement of the process for deciding which like higher quality CVE filing. We can follow up on that after we have these other 2 taken care of. So I thank everybody for the conversation today, for sharing the information and taking on the follow-ups. Like, I think we can improve our security hygiene just a little bit with these couple of actions. So as a reminder, we're not meeting next week because FOSDEM and the Fedora Strategy Summit are nearly upon us, and people will be traveling for that. So I think our next conversation is going to be February 4th. And I'm hoping we can just like talk about what happened at all of those events. But if that doesn't work, it'll be the week after. We'll talk about it in the Freckle Matrix chat. I hope to see you all there. Thanks for the discussion. I'll talk to you later. Bye.